Welcome back. Yes, indeed. We'll begin our conversation on that subject matter, Nigeria. And then we'll have Captain Roland Iyayi joining us here today. He's a former Managing Director and CEO, Nigeria Airspace Management Agency, NAMA. He is the President and CEO, Top Brass Aviation Limited. Good morning, sir. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Well, much as that report's members frown at how things have turned out, but I read comments credited to the former minister who happens to be the one in the eye of the storm behind this Nigeria Air saga. And he did say Nigeria Air Limited is obviously an entity known to Nigerian laws, and the partnership between entrepreneurs in Nigeria and entrepreneurs in the Ethiopia Airline Consortium. The consortium is a company belonging to many partners, and it is a very long journey that we started in 2016 and ended up with Nigeria. This was when he was quoted on May 26. What do you make of all of this?
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, if only the former minister would have listened to good advice, we shouldn't be where we are today. Nigeria Air, the way it's conceived, the structure he put in place, from our perspective as private airline owners, is nothing short of using taxpayers' money to sort of set up a private business. Because if you look at the fact that he had gone ahead to invite supposed partners, institutional investors, they were supposed to be holding on 46% of this enterprise. The Sovereign Wealth Fund was meant to have held 5% of this enterprise. Ethiopian Airlines, 49% of this enterprise. But what we found out in the last 1 week is changed the entire complexion of the transaction to mean that there's absolutely nothing like he's presented to the public as what it is. The hearing at the House a couple of days ago made it clear that apparently nothing like he had represented is a fact. Circle, that is meant to be one of the institutional shareholders, came to the hearing and said they were not even part of it. They were supposedly required to have signed a shareholders agreement only on Saturday after the unveiling of the Nigeria Air project. And the Nigerian investors, i.e. Circle and MRS, are required to pay $37.5 million each to make up for their equity. Ethiopian Airlines is not bringing anything to the table but aircraft and management. As a matter of fact, the Circle representative went on to say that Ethiopian Airlines is providing the executive management for this airline, meaning that all the 5 executive director positions are to be held by Ethiopians. So when you look at the entire structure, this is nothing more than a flag carrier, not a national airline. So we're very concerned, and this is why we've, continued to raise the issues in public fora to say that if the former minister wants to set up an airline of his own, he's at liberty to do that, but not with the taxpayers' money. And that is something that we are, having to, to sort of contend with, and it's been going on forever. So it is very important that the Nigerian public are aware of the fact that this is not necessarily what they've been told it is, and it will be. This is pretty much an enterprise that's been put together by an individual using government office to be able to sort of show up whatever investments they're looking at for the future, but not for the Nigerian people.
Tell us about these findings that you say you got in the last week. So are these documents in public space? Are they validated by the registration agencies and the Ethiopian government or Ethiopia Airlines? What information, how do we get across to some of these things?
Well, incidentally, it was a public hearing. So, individuals are invited, and they made pronouncements based on the facts that they had. Ethiopian Airlines didn't show up. MRS didn't show up. The Permanent Secretary of the Aviation Ministry came, and he was confronted with most of the facts. Invariably, most of the questions that were posed were evaded because there were no answers. But what we have said and consistently say is that the way and structure of this particular enterprise is not what you would call a national carrier. As a matter of fact, one of the revelations at the hearing was that this particular project also has a new transaction advisor, a company called Fairfax Nigeria Limited, and they hold 3%.
How new is this?
Well, we were told at the beginning of the transaction that the transaction advisors who were like required to build what you call the outline business case that was produced for the approval by the Federal Executive Council was Tianero. Now, we know Tianero produced the outline business case. There's supposed to be another, a full business case that's supposed to be presented to the ICRC, that's the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission, for approval before we can actually say they're going ahead with the final thing. But we don't have a full business case, yet we have an unveiling.
What do we, okay, yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, what's the generality of the Nigerian public were greeted with a few days ago as a result of the hearing that held in the House of Representatives? Apparently, the Senate had held its own before now, but the House of Representatives held theirs just last week. And the outcome of the conclusion which the House reached was that this entire I don't want to say fiasco, that's the word that comes to my mind, to describe what we saw with the unveiling of Nigeria Air, that it was a fraud, a scam. Did you agree with the conclusion?
Well, to the extent that I would say charade, because I mean the way it is, you don't come with an aircraft that is, you know, sort of emblazoned with a decal. You know, it wasn't even, you know, painted over. It was just a plastic decal on the aircraft showing Nigeria Air. And the purpose of that aircraft was to fly into the country, give Nigerians the impression that, oh, we have a new airline coming on, and basically the next day the aircraft was out of the country. The amount of money spent, we're not sure. So I'm not going to be postulating about monies expended. But I do not expect Ethiopian Airlines to fly the aircraft empty from Addis Ababa all the way to Abuja to spend the night there and turn around for free. And in any case, given where we are now with what we know, it is very clear that everything the former minister had said was, that Nigeria Air would represent and help stem. Everything that he said, I mean, that would happen, and it will never happen. For instance, he said, oh, if we had a national carrier, for instance, we would stem capital flight. That's not going to be the case. Because if you have a top management that is totally Ethiopian, airplanes operated by Ethiopia, not owned by Nigeria Air, wet leased to Nigeria Air, paid for by monies, equity contributed by the Nigerian partners, then obviously we're still going to end up with the same thing, capital flight. You're not going to be employing Nigerians any soon because the aircraft will be registered in Ethiopia. Except, of course, we have some sort of endorsement for their licenses to be able to fly those airplanes. So a lot of issues that he had raised, you know, that, oh, these are the advantages of this particular transaction and this is where it's going to take us as a country, all those things are false.
In other words, you endorse that it is a scam.
Well, I mean, to the extent that he hasn't addressed what he said he would address, then obviously, I mean, we've just been hoodwinked.
I'm a little curious because, I mean, if the minister did say that this conversation has been on since 2016, he also did allege at some point when he was questioned just a few weeks ago, maybe this year, a few months ago, can't quite remember, he said that there were serious obstacles. People in the industry wouldn't want Nigeria Air to see the light of day. And big questions arise as to what precisely were the objections that operators, stakeholders in the industry had about the coming on board of Nigeria Air.
Well, thank you very much. Again, we're not averse to another airline coming into the industry. In the last 6 months, we've had 3 local airlines join the market. Nigeria Air, the way it is conceived, is designed to decimate the domestic market to the detriment of the consumers. People don't see it yet.
Why would he do that?
Well, if you take the outline business case that was produced by Ethiopian Airlines and presented for approval. Ethiopian Airlines in that particular document had represented that they would undercut the market by 70% for between 12 and 24 months. What that means is that Ethiopian Airlines is willing to sell their seats on each flight below cost. When you sell your ticket below cost, then you're talking about predatory pricing. When you have predatory pricing in a market that is not, that is filled with operators that may not have strong financial backing. Because in Nigeria, airlines they're picking up monies from the banks at 22%. Ethiopia has the benefit of 3.5% from the Exim banks. We don't get that. So when you now have the leverage of cheap funds and come into a market where we don't have that, and then you're undercutting the market by that much, you would sooner or later, airlines will fail. And when these airlines fail, you start having a shortfall in capacity. When there's a shortfall in capacity, economics, the normal economics will kick in, demand and supply. The more you have people want to fly, the fewer the number of seats, fares will go up. Now, even when that happens, it affects the consumers. So we looked at all of this in its different ramifications and then came up with the conclusion that the way this has been structured, the intent is not for the purpose of endearing Nigerians to cheap flights like it said. No, ultimately Nigerians will pay more. And we just felt it wasn't a good thing to do at the time it was being done. In the meantime, when the federal government deregulated the market, private entrepreneurs came into the market. They have invested millions and billions of dollars to get into this market. Now, what is, in the current world, what is obtainable is countries designate what you call flag carriers. And you put the might of government behind them so that whatever provisions you have in your bilateral agreements are upheld. And how do you do that? There's what you call aeropolitics. When you designate an airline, for instance, to London, chances are the UK authorities may say, oh, look, we have slot restrictions, so they can't fly into Heathrow. That itself is a way to demarket the airline. So you as a government would insist, no, if you're going to be coming into our primary airports, you must insist that the local airline that you're designating must go into the primary airports.
Isn't that happening?
It's not happening. When Arik was designated to go into London, Arik started at Gatwick. They were not going to provide slots at Heathrow. It took forever to have that happen. And that already was putting Arik on the back foot. So the point is, if the government had played its role as a government then to ensure that whoever it is that is designated from Nigeria got a good deal from the host country, then you would empower the flag carriers out of your country and move it forward. Now, going back to what you asked, when you look at the structure of this particular transaction, the shareholders, the establishment agreement that was drafted by the Federal Ministry of Aviation for the Ethiopian government, Ethiopian Airlines to take on, the agreement was already providing Ethiopian with a 15-year tax moratorium.
Wow.
It was also providing Ethiopian, all manner of obnoxious, privileges that domestic airlines don't have.
All of this came out at the hearing?
We presented it to the House, yes.
And they were not disputed by the...
We had the document in the courts. The documents are before the courts. These are the documents from the ministry. So if you're giving them 15-year tax moratorium, the federal government, by the way, will be providing liability, indemnifying all the loans by this entity. What we said is that if that is happening, then this particular entity that is meant to be a private entity, because it's supposed to be a PPP project, if it's a private entity, then it is not a national carrier.
Not a flag carrier?
It will be a flag carrier, but as a private entity, the federal government should not be indemnifying their loans, should not be giving them a 15-year tax moratorium, which is what the private airlines do not have. So you create a distortion in the market when you do that. And doing that means that you would invariably, ultimately, you will kill what you have built. And when you do that,
What I find interesting is, is that this discussion, according to the minister, has been on since 2016.
With whom?
That's the very first tenure of President Buhari.
That's correct.
The idea to come up with an airline, and I think that conversation has been off and on as to whether or not we want to start another airline, whether it is the right thing to do. It's one thing to start a business, it's another thing to sustain it, and I think that's where a lot of Nigerians really had apprehensions. After all, we had Nigerian Airways before.
Yes.
So, looking at the discussions or looking at the thought alone around this Nigeria Air, weren't stakeholders engaging with the minister to say, look, Honorable Minister, if this is the plan that you have, it's not going to work. This plan is actually going to kill all the other businesses. Wasn't he taking all of these discussions on board and making adjustments as you were raising them?
Well, if you recall, yes, the issue of setting up a national carrier at some point maybe was in 2016, but the same government of former President Buhari stopped the process. And it took the president coming back sometime around 2018 to say, okay, let's look at it again. And then we had an unveiling at Farnborough. And then, of course, we came back again, there was a suspension of the process. So the issue had been that certain elements of what had been presented to the government were not tying up. They were not adding up. So there had been stops and starts. In terms of engagement with the industry, the former minister hardly engaged on this particular issue with the industry. As a matter of fact, it was only after the AON had gone to the National Assembly to raise an alarm to say, look, we have these issues. If this is allowed to go forth the way it is, the entire industry will suffer. And then when we presented that to the National Assembly, both the House and the Senate, they mandated the Honorable Minister to sit down with the domestic airlines and thrash out the issues. We had one meeting. And at that meeting, the same issues we're talking about were expressed, and he said, okay, you know something, we would have several more meetings where all of these things will be thrashed. Till today, that was the only meeting we ever had.
All right, let's bring in our colleagues from Lagos.
Well, thank you, Chamberlain. Captain Iyayi, it's interesting that, so many revelations are emerging from our conversation with you. For instance, you talk about how Ethiopia Airlines has a stake, how, their pricing will be predatory, how they have a 3% stake, from the Exim Bank. If all of these details were in public domain, or perhaps at the level of the Ministry of Aviation, the question is, how come the lawmakers at the Red and Green Chamber under the past administration were not availed of this information to the extent that they would have carried out their oversight functions to bring Ministry of Aviation officials to account?
Thank you very much. Well, I recall clearly that there was a particular sitting at the National Assembly House of Representatives. And then, of course, there was another sitting, there was a joint sitting. At that particular sitting at the House of Representatives, the Committee on Aviation charged the Honorable Minister at the time to provide all the documents that were necessary so that they would be able to reach an informed decision. And he offered that he was going to do that, but he never did, but still went ahead to proceed with the project the way he wanted it. Now, at the last hearing we had just last week, or this week, early this week, it became clear that it was as if the intent was to try and sidetrack the oversight functions of the National Assembly and still proceed with the project in any case, except, of course, that the Airline Operators of Nigeria had gone to court to obtain restraining orders to have this matter determined before, the whole thing could proceed. I don't think the minister wanted the necessary oversight, because all the documents that he was requested to provide, as at 2 days ago when the House of Rep members sat, had not been provided.
So the officials went ahead with this unveiling, as they would call it, in spite of this court order that you talk about. So with this court order, what is the status of the carrier?
Well, I mean, the order of court said at the time, this was as far back as October, November, that the status quo be maintained. At that particular point in time, there were no negotiations that had been had with any parties. But what we were told by the permanent secretary 2 days ago was that there'd been negotiations ongoing with the different parties. Now, that itself means that the order of court, had been flouted. And this has been ongoing, so invariably, at the appropriate time, I would expect that the attorneys would take the necessary steps to ensure the contempt orders are brought to book.
Captain Iyayi, I'd like you to educate us. The story is that the national carrier does not have a license. That's what we're told by Captain Olumide, the interim managing director, that they do not have a license. And we also gather that they were able to get to stage 3 of the certification processes. In spite of that, we saw the launch of the national carrier, or the flag carrier, as the case may be. Is that in line with the due process? Could they have gone ahead with the launch without going through all of the processes required and without having a license?
Again, they were actually, the Nigeria Air project is actually at the stage 1, not stage 3 of the AOC, that's the Air Operator Certification process. Again, what you saw is basically the impunity that the last minister had, engaged in pretty much everything he did. There was no basis for the launch because there was no certification for the airline to have been in place. But he still went ahead and did it anyways because he had promised Nigerians we would launch on or before the 29th of May. And that's essentially what he did. But in terms of having due process or whatever it is, there was nothing.
Well, Captain, in the light of the resolution of the House of Representatives, what do you see happening? Do you see those issues? Do you see any hope for the flag carrier or national carrier as the, well, you said it's a flag carrier. Do you see any chance that whatever money has been invested, whatever efforts have gone into it, bearing any fruit in the shortest or longest of time?
In the short term, no. In the long term, it depends on what this new government wants to do. I mean, the government of Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu can decide to say, yes, indeed, Nigeria needs a national carrier. I mean, a national carrier would mean that it is substantially owned and effectively controlled by the state. But if you're having a minority stake, then obviously it cannot be a national carrier. So we need to clear that. Now, if the government decides that that's the path to take, then of course I'm almost certain they will put in place, the necessary structures to ensure that the arrangement or the process can be done properly and according to the law.
Well, Captain, in that light, I remember that, I mean, something you're also aware of, that AMCON is in receivership of a number of airlines. And we had Captain Sanusi here last week saying, look, rather than reinvent the wheel, why not use what we have with AMCON? And I also recall that in 2019, the statement was put out by AMCON, quoting the MD of AMCON, saying, look, Arik Air, for instance, has the capacity to stand as a national carrier. Is that something that could have been explored by the Federal Ministry of Aviation? And why not, if you agree?
Again, we need to be very careful. The AMCON project in both Arik and Aero Contractors are pretty much controversial. Arik, in receivership, was sued by the owners of Arik, and they got a judgment asking AMCON to provide what you call a stewardship in the last 6 years. Recall that NG Eagle was set up out of Arik using Arik assets, and from what the court ruled, it would amount to asset stripping. So it's very important. We need to be careful whether or not that itself is not an illegality. Now, in the case of Aero Contractors, AMCON owns 60% of Aero Contractors. Now, if the federal government, believing that taxpayers' money have been invested in all these entities, yes, it could have been possible to work out a structure by which those assets clearly belonging to the federal government could have been consolidated into a new entity that could have been called a national carrier. In that case, we know that it is essentially fully owned by the federal government. But, to do that also, you need to look at all the legal issues surrounding those entities, because we're very clear that there was a judgment in favor of the promoters of ARIC asking for stewardship to be an account of stewardship to be provided by AMCON to them in the last 6 years. So that itself might not be the best way to look at it. In terms of having a national carrier, though, it is possible for the country to structure something, but that itself would mean bringing together all the different stakeholders and getting a consensus in terms of how they would want it structured, their interests in it. And I believe to a large extent, if you bring together most of the domestic operators and talk to them, the country can fashion a way forward in getting something that all parties will be amenable to, but not something that will force down everybody's throat to now, sort of jeopardize the entire investments that people have put in the industry.
Well, it's really interesting. When one finds out that if a state, one of the 36 states in the country, could have an airline that is running as it is, one wonders whether or not it's rocket science to have a national carrier. But let me ask you this one last question before I throw back to my colleagues in Abuja. Recently, IATA put out a statement saying that listing Nigeria as the topmost of the countries that have 68% of blocked funds in the world. Nigeria has blocked funds of $812.2 million that the airlines cannot repatriate to their countries. What exactly is playing out here? Is there something the Minister of Aviation at the time could have done? Why are the funds blocked? How significant is that in the area of encouraging foreign direct investment in the country?
Well, essentially, if you understand that the foreign airlines operating into Nigeria operate on the basis of a bilateral air services agreement, and that agreement itself clearly states what needs to be done by parties. Now, the funds we're talking about is actually earnings by all these foreign airlines that they have not been able to repatriate out of a country. The bilateral agreement they've signed with Nigeria, makes it mandatory that those monies, be repatriated. Now, what has happened over the years, I believe, is simply because we have had a shortfall in our earnings and, of course, Forex. But I think, importantly, because we're talking about a treaty and an international agreement, this is an obligation by the country, and it does not portend well for the country. In terms of foreign direct investments, if people coming into your country cannot see the possibility of being able to move monies they have earned legitimately out of a country, then of course what that means is that ultimately they will look for other climes in which to invest their monies. So it is not a good thing in terms of FDIs for Nigeria. Now, let us also say this. When the government of former President Buhari came into power, it inherited over $400 million in terms of monies also trapped, by the previous government. That was not, trapped, for airlines by the previous government. And it actually paid off those monies almost immediately. However, in the last 8 years, we've also run into the deficit by making sure that not only we're not even talking 400 million now, we're talking twice that amount has not been able to, the airlines have not been able to repatriate in that period. So I think the government needs to do something as a matter of urgency to ensure that, in the eye of a public, in the eye of the world, we're seen as, responsible entities. We shouldn't be reneging on obligations we have to the world. That doesn't portend well for the entire country.
Well, Captain, something you said earlier, takes my interest, and that is the fact that you said the federal government under the previous administration gave some concessions to Ethiopian Airlines the other time, and I'm wondering, why do you think it's difficult, or those kinds of concessions were not made to state carriers, to private airlines that operate within the country, who are not under AMCON and who are doing fairly well.
This is where we have the double standards, and it's also one of the reasons we actually kicked. If it is understood by the government that the environment in which private airline operators are operating in the country is harsh, is hostile, and the conditions necessary for their success is known, it behoves on the government to ensure that those conditions are presented to the airlines. But in this particular case, Ethiopian, in its outline business case, in its business in a bid, clearly indicated to the federal government that the only way the Nigeria Air project can succeed is to have all those conditions provided. And the government went ahead to provide it for them. So we are asking, what is so different in our case? If the airline, if Ethiopian could see that already, what is difficult in the government understanding that doing the same for Nigerian carriers would make them better and stronger and be able to serve the same purpose? But that hasn't been done. Instead, it was going to be looked at for an Ethiopian entity coming into Nigeria. Again, understand that the Nigeria Air project is a private project. So if you're going to be giving 15-year tax moratorium, you're going to be giving loan liability and indemnities to this entity, and you're not doing that to the Nigerian private entrepreneurs, then you're creating a market distortion. Ultimately, some airlines will fail.
Interesting, Captain Iyayi. You also said something earlier that Ethiopian Airlines would not have sent that chartered airline with which, a demonstration of the unveiling of the flag carrier was done without some form of payment. And this flag carrier, according to what we were told by the Buhari administration, was supposed to have gulped about $300 million. Now, what questions should we be asking, of the immediate past Minister of Aviation as, handover notes are given to this new administration? Should there be a probe of some sorts?
Well, I'm not sure about a probe, but I think it's important for accountability. In what we know, and we did this before we actually went public, we went through the process of reviewing necessary documents and records, and we found that between 2016 and 2022, budgetary appropriations for Nigeria Air totaled 85.42 billion naira. The permanent secretary of aviation, a couple of days ago at the House, said only 3 billion odd was ever spent. But even at that, we need to understand, in all of this, what monies have been allocated, what monies were appropriated, what monies were spent. All of these are things that need to be said so that at least we understand clearly the worth of this national carrier, if it turns out to be the case. Because, there's no way you can be talking about so much money without understanding what the capitalization of the airline is, to know what the worth of a 49% stake in the company would be. And then if you're saying that somebody can come in and take 49% of a company for nothing, what exactly is coming to the table? Let me give this example. Rwanda Air is one of the fastest growing airlines in Africa today. And Rwanda is a country of less than 5 million people, if I'm not mistaken. Rwanda Air sold 49% stake in Rwanda Air to Qatar Airways. And Qatar Airways paid $1.3 million. It didn't stop at that. Qatar Airways has also invested $2 billion building a brand new airport in Rwanda. Those sort of investments should be coming out of Nigeria, because Nigeria has the mass market. Nigeria has a strategic regional hub that can evolve clearly in these parts. Not Rwanda, but for the sake of the fact that our climate is not helpful to investments, we've had all of this lost. And I think it's important that the new government should look at how it is we can make sure that such investments are not taken to other climes, but Nigeria. We have the market. Every airline in Africa wants to come into Nigeria. Because this is where we have the mobile, I mean, the population in Nigeria is mobile. So we need to understand that, and we need to take advantage of that. And beyond, there's also the single African air transport market that's coming up. This is a first-comers market, and for Nigeria, our flag carriers must be made strong enough to be able to stay competitive and take advantage of it. And of course, you have the, I mean, the African, the Continental Trade Treaty as well that's been signed. These are things that Nigerian carriers should take full advantage of. And to now see us giving that away to a third party to the detriment of our country is what we are saying is not right. And it must be taken care of by this new government to ensure that whatever is required to bring us back to vibrancy is done.
You know, looking through some of these things and statements coming from the former minister, Sirika in this case, for instance, what do we make of this when he says, after a careful, detailed and ICRC governed selection process, Ethiopian Airlines has been selected as preferred bidder, offering an ownership consortium of 3 Nigerian investors. He wanted to name MRS, SACO, NSI, FG owning 5%, ET 49, and it goes on. And when you see all these kind of statements, and then industry stakeholders give their perspective on this matter, you just tend to wonder and ask yourselves, so what do we then need to do moving forward?
Well, again, I believe strongly that if things are done properly, and to do things properly, there has to be full engagement. You would not expect people
engagement of what, stakeholders?
Stakeholders is
in terms of conversation,
in any
or
sector,
ownership.
In any sector, if you want to see growth, you must engage the stakeholders. You are a government. You're not the one actively playing in the market. You are providing the enabling environment for the market to thrive. So to do that, you must engage people in the market to understand what the issues are. If you understand what the issues are, you will provide the solution to such problems. You don't create the problems. So in this particular case, he, rather than take on and engage stakeholders to understand what the issues are, even where he understood the issues, based on what he was told by Ethiopian Airlines, he ignored the domestic carriers.
Did they ignore them, or that they didn't take it seriously? They thought this wasn't going to take off. It was DOA from the get-go, and so they didn't bother as much, and so he had to go on with the preferred bidder, as he called Ethiopian Airlines.
You see, we need to be very factual when we talk. I mean, the Honorable Minister has come public and said, oh, he tried to engage domestic operators, they ignored him. That's not entirely correct. There was a portal that was set up for this bid. The very first entry on that portal, it's electronic. It shows you the name of who came in, the IP address, the time and the date. The very first company that had access to that portal was Airpeace. And we have the records, and it's before the courts. So when you say there was no interest, how come Airpeace was the very first airline to access the portal if they were not interested? Several other private entities got into the portal. However, if you take what you call the outline business case, and this is where we say there was a contrived outcome. The outline business case on page 84 had said that we should be looking at either Qatar Airways or Ethiopian Airlines as the preferred bidder. So if you already go into a system or into an arrangement with that mindset, everything you're trying to do would work to that. So when you now turn around and tell us, oh, there's a single bidder, did you allow access to all the other all the other bidders? In any case, what conditions did you provide to arrive at the preferred bidder? Your conditions already had, ostracized all the private operators, because you'd ask for all sorts of, in terms of experience, in terms of wherewithal, you've set the standards of the bar, so to speak, way so high. Ethiopian has been in the market 75 years. Most domestic carriers have been there barely 10 years. So if you're asking for an airline with 15 years experience in the international market, you wouldn't get it, not from the domestic market. So invariably you have done that to quietly remove them from the consideration. Now, in any case, if you say, oh, we want a strategic partner, but we need to bring the domestic carriers on board, have a neutral management, and see how we can, shape things. It would have been different. But you did this, definitely, from our view, there was a contrived outcome ab initio. Because if you put that in a business case that you presented for approval, what you're saying is that either of these two are the ones we want to go with.
So are you saying then that there is no, because there are those who say that this airline could still take off. There are those who say, even Captain Olumide at the hearing said, oh, we're just trying to get new management. New management means we have to go back and start from the very first.
From the scratch.
Yes, from the scratch again. If that is the situation, are you saying that there is nothing on the ground to show that indeed anytime soon Nigeria Air could take off?
If we go by what we know today, Nigeria Air probably will not start maybe for another earliest 18 months if things are done properly. Now, if Nigeria is coming in as a government-owned entity, then the structure we're talking about today will not be the same structure. So all of these things are issues to be addressed by the incoming government to say that, okay, if the interest is really a national carrier, then let's do a national carrier. If the interest is to say a flag carrier, then leave the market for the private entrepreneurs who are there today.
All right.
If you're going to midwife a national carrier, the structure on the ground that you're meeting now is not the structure to adopt. It has to be totally different. And then it has to be a level playing field.
Well, I will be the Minister of Aviation. Your work is cut out for you already. Captain Roland Iyayi, former Managing Director and CEO of NAMA, and President, CEO, Top Brass Aviation. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We will be back in a moment. Do stay with us.